afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending upon where you are in the world. I want you to know that this is the beginning of our new podcast series, and this is Jonathan Taylor, and I'm here in downtown Huntington Beach on the pier, and we're going to bring to you, I think, a unique series of videos, a much better series of videos than you may have seen. And I'll let you know that this is where I grew up, meaning Orange County, Garden Grove, Huntington Beach, Irvine, different areas, Laguna Beach. And let's get underway.
To whoever's going to be watching down the road, but we were supposed to start about maybe 4 or 5 hours ago, but now back that we're finally here at my premiere podcast for KARLS Korner with my phenomenal friend that I met actually 3 years ago, Jonathan Taylor, who's now in Palm Springs, California. And he graciously accepted my invitation for my first podcast. So Jonathan, I welcome you.
Well, thank you.
Here.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone around the world, wherever you are.
Yes. So
how are you, my friend?
I just found that like 30 minutes right before.
Okay.
Oh, great. How about you?
On? Very good. What's going on?
Well, you know me, I've always wanted to do this when we have our lunches. We were going to, why don't we put this on a podcast? And through the grace of God,
right.
And when I went back
like
to my other friends.
What would you like to ask me?
What do I like to ask you? You're a phenomenal, you have a heck of a past. Tell the people who you are.
I'm a classical guitarist. If you want to know my music, type Jonathan Taylor guitar into Google. I've had 32 albums.
I have this. I'm going to pull this to the side, some of your music.
Oh, look at that.
I'm going to play it.
Okay. Go for it.
Go. Guitarist. Yes. This is what you do. So tell the people about your background, how you got involved with it, and who you are today. Anytime you want to say anything, just come on in.
This is an American medley, #1, that I arranged for classical guitar many years ago. Songs of Stephen Foster, songs of, and maybe we can shut that down because it's just skipping around. And songs from the American 19th century. And that's really what that is. You can edit that out and put it back in later.
Well, actually, I have the video feed off, and I just have the audio playing. If they probably could hear the audio. Well, just give a little bit about your background and how you got involved with music at a young age and all that.
I was inspired. I've been playing the guitar since I was 10 years old, actually 4 years old. This is on some of the videos you can see on YouTube and my app that is there on Google Play and Apple Music. I studied with great artists like Christopher Parkening, Pepe Romero, Frederick Node. Maybe people don't know Frederick Node, but he had a PBS special years ago called Playing Guitar. That he was an Englishman and then became a professor at Chapman College and Redlands, and was a prominent figure, let's say, in the 70s. And so I took private lessons with Pepe Romero. I studied at Chapman. It's called university now, but Chapman College. When I went there, there were 800 students, and I was on full presidential scholarship. And it was a private college. It was not funded by the state, the government, which is very different now. There's a law school, there's a film school that Marion Knott gave a lot of funding for that film school building. It's actually a big time film school now too. And at that time I went, it was a big time music department. I studied with a great composition teacher, Victor Savant. I was a triple major and in music, and composition was one of my, and arranging was one of my main things. So I wrote many symphonic pieces, orchestral, should we say string quartets, brass quintets, whatever. But really my main focus was to become a virtuoso performer. And that is really what I concentrated on. And then toured around the world, everywhere you can think of, all over Hell's Half Acre, in very unusual spots, not just you would think Europe and America, but also India, the Philippines, Romania, the Amazon, which is a very unusual thing. There's an opera house that was built for Caruso in the early 1920s in Belém, which is one of the cities on the mouth of the Amazon River, which goes, all the way up to Bolivia. And of course, obviously, when I say Amazon, Brazil. And so in many strange and unusual places, as well as the European capitals that you would imagine, or American capitals. I remember touring in the American South as well, which I absolutely adore. I love those people. And it's great. I have a video that I did that's called Adventures in Touring on my app, of all the adventures I've had. And one of them was when I toured the American South on my way back home to California, which is where I live and have lived. I met the head of JPL. And so he and I had a long conversation while we were on our way back from Tennessee. He was up there in, Huntsville, Alabama, with the space camp or that. And I had a very interesting conversation because I told him basically that NASA had blown it after the moon missions. And what I meant was that they had not captured the imagination of the American people really after the adventure of the moon trip, because, sending probes out, it's great, it's wonderful. But on the other hand, I know why they didn't get their funding. Because we'd won the space race against the Russians. They were no longer a threat. And now men weren't going to the moon. As a matter of fact, like the third moon mission, they were losing viewership and it was becoming passé. And now, of course, we're going back to the moon with NASA and Elon Musk and Artemis 1, 2, 3, et cetera. Artemis 1's been there. So
that's another podcast for another. That's another podcast for another time.
Another time. And they're actually going to use the 3D printers to build launching pads and little like sidewalks or things to put the units on the pods that people are going to live in, because I understood that when you take off, because you're going to be using super heavy, that rocket, not a small rocket, but it'll disrupt things so much that they want to, the moon dust will go up and all that they want to have a more solid platform from which to launch from. Anyway, so that gives you kind of a brief, and that's, 1,000 stories. Toured with in the Philippines, it was the same concert series as a great singer, Luciano Pavarotti, who I actually met about 4 times in my life. I actually saw his first tour out here to America at UCLA. He was playing at Royce Hall and I was playing at Schoenberg Hall. And so I had met him, and it was just a wonderful singer, incredibly wonderful man too. And at that time, he was a lot smaller than what he ended up being. Just some adventures there in touring and in.
He loved his Italian food, that's for sure.
Yeah. Loved his Italian food, a great Italian. And at the time when I say I met him on his first American tour, it's because I go, well, at the time he would be touring the opera houses of his country, of Italy. he'd take that train and go back and forth. And then later, came to America and did, Covent Garden and that in England, other places. But I go, that was the beginnings of his career. He's actually wasn't singing opera. He was just doing a recital of, chansons and German lied and Italian operas and opera arias, I mean. So.
Well, what got you? I know you say you have a fascinating when you were a young child with your mother and
grandmother.
And
grandmother.
Your grandmother.
Grandmother was
yes.
a silent film. Grandmother was a silent film organist who played the Orpheum circuit and played for Mr. Fox of now 20th Century Fox movie studios. At the time, he was the owner of vaudeville houses, and that, of course, is where many performers that people either know or forgotten now. Charlie Chaplin was a vaudevillian. So was what's his name? Buddy Ebsen was a hoofer. Was a vaudevillian. There are many people, and my grandmother played.
Do you have any pictures? You have pictures of your grandmother about with all these stars from back in the day? Because
I don't have
those pictures collaborated.
I don't have pictures of her with Harry Houdini, who she played with many times up in the Pacific Northwest. Harry Houdini played up there, and he took a year off, to come down here and do a film. They tried to convince him to do films, and he did a couple films, and he hated it. He rented a house here in LA for a year, and he hated it because he wasn't making any money. And so I go, well, he basically could fill an auditorium anywhere in the country, or when he's being thrown over in a barrel in Niagara Falls, or all his stunts and things. And my grandmother knew him very well because I would say, what about him? She'd say, well, he was always trying to make time with the chorus girls backstage. But then she said, but he was so good. He was so good, Jonathan. And I go, yeah, the whole world knows that. And so she played with those people. She played with Keystone Cops, Charlie Chaplin, I mentioned. She was there at the theater in 1930, I think it was, in LA, when Einstein and Chaplin were at the Los Angeles theater, and the guy had premiered City Lights. The owner, I think it was Grauman, wasn't it? Sid Grauman had premiered City Lights, Chaplin's film, of course. And so she hung around and knew all those people and performed. And at that time, she made a tremendous living, for a woman for that period. I go, oh, she made a bank, as the saying goes. I go, she made a ton of money, and was very, very, she was very cultured. And one time during the 20s, when my mother was my mother was born in 1920, so through 20 and 30, or Prohibition is after.
We're talking 100 years. We're talking about 100 years ago now.
Yeah, well, Prohibition is after that, isn't it? Prohibition is 29, right? So after that,
Prohibition wasn't Prohibition 20 to 33.
Is that what it was? Okay, I don't know. I don't know.
20 to 33.
But then why it was called the Roaring 20s, because they were all boozing and having a good time. Well, whenever Prohibition,
the economy was going great, everybody was having a good time, and then the factions saying the evil liquid, alcohol, beer, and all that. That
right.
But
they tried to
attribute it worse.
They had tried to attribute the alcoholism was the only reason for men beating up their wives and committing violence. And I go, well, most people I know that drink, they don't get violent. They just go to sleep. But, that's their, and I go, and they created the greatest crime wave in history. But but back to my grandmother, she was a very fine artist, a great virtuoso. I have a video of her at 100 at a birthday party I threw for her. And she was still, those crooked arthritic hands could still execute arpeggios magnificently. And I go, well, up to the day she died, she was still the same virtuoso she was when she was 16. And so when people say, how was I influenced? I go, well, I grew up hearing that in the background, so I'm sure it got imbued into me. It got, burnished into me in some fashion.
So in our discussions a while back, you mentioned you wanted to go into pop music, but you had this desire to take this to a different level, correct?
Yeah, that's true. And also, I wanted to be the real deal. I wanted to be an accomplished artist, not a pop player that just strummed around and did a few songs. When I heard Segovia, I realized the difficulty of the instrument and its capacity polyphonically. And so that's not to cast aspersions on pop people and that, but it's just that, it's a whole different level of playing. And in order to arrange the pieces that can cross over from different genres, one has to have the chops to do that. I can tell you that the hardest instrument, and remember, this is coming from a person who's written for every orchestra instrument that there is. I can tell you that to write for a string quartet is nothing in comparison to arranging for the classical guitar. And the reason I say that is the technical problems are massive. Also, it's the only orchestral instrument that's tuned in fourths, the guitar, where all the other orchestral instruments are tuned in thirds. And so you have all fourths.
And see, that's something that I would
Yeah.
see, something that I would never know because I'm not that musically inclined at how you just mentioned that, how they're tuned. So
well, that's why you have the voicings that are so unusual and different. The voicings on the guitar, of course, are going to come off differently than they would on instruments tuned in thirds. So if you have a violin, which is usually playing one string, of course, they don't just do that, they play the other strings as well. But I used to train violinists when I was head of the Newport Institute of the Arts there many years ago. And they would say, how can you play so many double and triple stops? What is that? And I go, guitarists would call that a chord, a dyad, a triad, a tetrachord. Okay. And I'd say, well, that's the thing, isn't it? And for technically, it's much easier to play an instrument where you don't have those complexities. Not that violin isn't a wonderful and a great instrument, and I'm not casting aspersions on it or trying to denigrate it in any way. It's beautiful, but it also has the ability to create a sustained sound with a guitar. It's an illusion. To be able to create a sustained sound, well, it's actually physically impossible. And what do I mean by that? Well, the minute you hit the note, just like the piano, it decays. Guitar has been called a string instrument, but technically, in the family of orchestral instruments, it's really a percussion instrument. And when people say, well, how can you say that? And I go, because it's struck. But the piano is also that way. But the piano also has the value or the technical ability to hit a sustain pedal, and it'll hold the chord if you press the pedal down with your foot. But the reason why it's considered in certain ways a percussion instrument is because it's struck just like a hammer is struck on a string with the piano or on a harpsichord plucked. And so what happens the moment you hear the string? I go, well, it decays. So does that happen with the violin? I go, no, it's a bowed instrument. So as you're putting the bow across it, you can crescendo with it, you can accelerando with it, you can do lots of things with it because of that bow. But I go, the guitar, you have to overcome that to make it have legato or smoothness or connection. Carl.
So back here, I'm actually producer director behind here. And so I find it all fascinating, but we're now living in 2023 when obviously the music business is a completely different
Very different.
When we grow up. We're
right.
A little bit different. I'm a little bit older than you. I just reached a big milestone. You're a little bit behind me, but we both grew up with a phenomenal era of all kind of music coming up with our parents, with the 40s and 50s, with Sinatra and all the big bands and all that, and then developing the rock, which classic rock, Motown. But where do you see yourself now with your background and your music? Now, you said a lot about the old way with having a record label, and then
The
really that
label
know
that the label that has released my first album with them. I have 32 albums with different things at other times, but with them now are it's a compilation album that is called Guitar Chronicles and available on all the streaming services and that. But it has unique arrangements of, for instance, an orchestral adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. And then the American Medley, which you saw playing there, and the American Medley 1 and 2. There is also an adaptation I did of some of the themes from the Bond films. And then there's standard masterpieces like Sevilla and Leyenda. Sevilla is a classic guitar piece, which is actually originally written for piano. A lot of people don't know Albéniz never wrote for the guitar, even though everyone thinks he did. I go, well, all his pieces, Leyenda or Asturias, is a piano piece. It was an adaptation. So many, many different pieces on that. A Bach double, which is originally a lute piece. And so many different styles, a couple jazz pieces on there. So it's 12 tracks. And so if you just typed in Jonathan Taylor Guitar Chronicles, you could find it on Spotify or Apple, whatever the streaming services you use, Pandora, etc. So Hit Lab is the label, but the distributorship is Warner Brothers. And I think they call them Warner Records now, not Warner Brothers. So that album is there. I have an app too that's in the Jonathan Taylor app, which has all sorts of videos, lessons, performances, interviews, many things. That's, if you go to Google Play or you go to Apple, just type in Jonathan Taylor, you'll see the app. It's free to download. There's all sorts of free stuff on there. And then there's member stuff too.
So how has the reaction been? I know you were very excited when you first launched.
Very good. It's very great. Yeah.
What kind of reaction are you getting?
I think I'm getting great reaction, and I'm working on it all the time with the app developers. Right. And
now, my question that I think I've the last 2 years now, you having any scheduled live performances?
No, and I'm not interested. I'm not interested in doing that right now. I'm working with the recording.
I'm just curiously why.
Because my time is being taken up by arranging, by filming, by working the app, by collating other albums for the new record company that will be later released at whatever. And because there's only so many hours in the day. That's why.
Okay. But you do eventually want to be out there doing some live shows.
I'll go back on tour again sometime in the future. I don't know when that is.
And then who would happen to be maybe your tour manager?
You know what? That is up to Hit Lab, who's in charge of that.
Well, I would love to come here and document that for you. You know that.
I'm in charge of that. And I've never toured with you. I've never toured, Carl. I've always toured alone. Most instrumentalists or soloists like me tour alone. They don't have a big entourage. It's not Led Zeppelin. It's not a rock.
I know you don't need roadies.
Right. So it's a whole different world. So I can tell you that I've been some of the most harrowing places in the world. I always tell people, I walk down the streets of Calcutta at midnight, and people say, "Why'd you do that?" And I go, "In order to strengthen my courage." So there's many stories related to those types of adventures. And to tour alone is very different than touring with other people.
Now, were you always the solo actor, or was anybody else on the bill?
That's it.
You were always by yourself?
End of story. That's it. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I just always find it fascinating with your background, with your grandmother's background. And anytime we've had our lunches in Huntington at a couple our favorite spots, always, we'd always be like, "Oh my God, 3 hours have gone by." And we always said, we should put this on a podcast. I
Yeah,
think, thank God, the grace of God, we finally able to be on here.
here it
And I
is.
appreciate you being on my first one. And we're going to be the first of many. And, you know, I like to do maybe a little bit more. I think maybe I know I can't edit in here. I could probably go back and then put some other pieces in here, some other pictures in here. So when you're
Sure.
mentioning things, I could. But I think,
Right.
you know, now you're right now in Palm Springs now, correct?
Correct.
And you're going to be going to different places. You're going to be where
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the next
I'm in
week or
Palm
two.
Springs
Maybe we
right
could.
now, and I'm preparing repertoire, and that I can tell you that there's a video. Many of the places, you know, what's interesting is a friend of mine, a musician friend of mine, turned me on to a Frank Sinatra thing about him in Palm Springs, and all those restaurants that he went to are still out here. The majority of them are, maybe a few aren't, and they're really fun. Pardon me?
It wasn't him and Bob Hope, the one who really made Palm Springs into what it is, as
Say,
like
absolutely.
their getaway from Los Angeles.
He forced the club owners to get the Marx Brothers to be members of the club. He did all sorts of. He's an incredibly. Mr. Sinatra was a very generous, enlightened man. He really made it in. You know, the Bobby Soxer thing, which is pre-rock and roll kind of. He was the originator of that type of phenomena. And when he got From Here to Eternity, you know, that film, I go, that launched him super big. And I go, the rest is history. Everyone knows. And I go, he felt his home was here. And he's an East Coaster, right? And he's an East Coaster.
Yeah, he's from Hoboken. Yeah, he grew up in Hoboken, and right across from the bridge from, but not the bridge, right over from the Hudson River from New York City.
And people think
I actually went by his original house.
He had some crappy jobs too. He had some crappy jobs.
Well,
he was a rivet.
In
the beginning, when he was younger, he was not a rivet maker, but a rivet catcher or something. You had these hot rivets that people would.
Rivets. Yes.
Yeah. And I go, he had some really crummy jobs when he was a kid. And the skinny kid from Hoboken, I go, yeah, he became one of the biggest influences of that generation. So, and he was a very kind man, very kind man, very thoughtful.
Yes. But he was very forceful, that he didn't take any crap from anybody, and he kind of, you know, ruled the area, and it's just his presence alone.
Right, but I don't think he was. I think he had a good heart. I don't think he was like a mobster type. You know, I don't think he was like.
Well, we all know that there were certain influencers that got him to certain spots, but
that may be true.
There,
right. That may be true. I don't know. I have no knowledge.
In Vegas.
Yeah.
Well,
I have no
we could have another podcast about that, with my background and knowing when you used to come in the Philadelphia area, play the old Latin Casino, and then the casinos in Atlantic City. But the biggest one, when he was, you know, the Rat Pack in Vegas, that with Sammy Davis playing, like, he was appalled at realizing that after the show at the Sands, he had to go back to the special neighborhood where, you know, they wouldn't allow him to have a room. So Frank just went to the general manager or the owner of the Sands and said, look, if he doesn't have a suite, not a room, a suite. And they said, well, how come he can't have one? Well, if he can't have one, I'm not performing. I'm done. Sammy stayed at the Sands. He had a suite, you know, so that's all well known and documented.
You know,
but,
when you speak about Sammy Davis and his eye and that, and he had his auto accident, I always, you know what I always think about? I think about Peter Falk, because he also had an artificial eye. Yeah. Peter Falk's eye actually had to come out when he was a baby, when he was 3 years old, because he had a cancer behind his eye. So it's a different thing than an accident, right? Than a car accident. So yeah, Sammy, well, I had a thinking of talking about the people of the past, the ambassador. My buddy Lon closed the Ambassador Hotel. When is that? The 70s? I don't know. And he closed the hotel. The closing night, his pop group did, with Sammy. And Sammy was there singing Candyman, right? And so my buddy closed that night. Now, the Ambassador was one of the premier hotels. I have another connection with that's interesting, because my aunt, Juliana Donovan, was head of the Ambassadorettes. That was her fashion models there at the Ambassador Hotel. She had a little office. When I was a little boy, I'd go to that office, and she had this little kind of cubicle office, not cubicle, but not very big office. And she was girlfriends with my mother in high school. And the Donovans were very close friends with the Reagans. My aunt and Nancy Reagan were very close. They went to all the inaugurals, all that stuff back in that era. And she was head of the Ambassadorettes and ran the runway. And my mother occasionally would model for her. She'd say to my mother, Argonne, who is my mother's first name, from the Argonne Forest in France. And she'd say, Argonne, can you come down and, help me? We're missing somebody. And she'd go down there and model. And my mother would be, who was trying to pick her up all the time because she was so beautiful, Mel Torme. And Mel Torme would try to, date her. So Ambassador, it's just another, link in a long line of, showbiz stuff from my grandmother on down to all that stuff. And my friend Lon that had a group that closed the closing night at the Ambassador. That was a legendary hotel, probably the greatest hotel in Los Angeles at that time period.
Yeah, doesn't the building still stand? I know it's maybe not.
It's a school or something now, a college, a school. But I think a lot of it was knocked down, at least renovated. And but I remember being there as a little kid, and met who was it? Zaza Gabor and Ava Gabor. I met the Gabor sisters because my aunt, and I call her my aunt because she's my Dutch aunt that. I grew up with, and she and her husband, my Uncle Stan, were great people, wonderful people. And they were, she was Hungarian. And so she knew the Gabor sisters very well, very intimately. Ava and Zaza.
We're dating ourselves by most people that are young age and would have no clue what we're talking about. But at this point, we really don't care. This is for a different audience.
Right. The only thing one can do is tell the truth. And
that's what we're doing.
Yeah. And either people accept it or they don't, or they're not interested, and that's fine. So I go, well, what else is there? So I would meet Barry Sullivan, another actor that was there at the Ambassador. Anyway, so there's a couple Ambassador stories.
Well, I want to thank you for when I was in Vegas a month ago, that steakhouse that we went to, it was like, because it opened in 54 or 55, and it still has the plush leather seats.
It's my favorite steakhouse in Vegas.
Yes, but you could. Yeah, where did they serve you when the men are still in tuxedos? That's old school.
Very true.
But and actually, the food wasn't really that bad. Now, I had the surf and turf, which, was over 100, but still try to go out anywhere and try to have a dinner like that. But it was interesting going into that place. Outside is a very nondescript building, but inside
it looks like a crummy mall. It looks like a 70s mall or something. Mall. And I go, you go inside, it's magic.
Yes. It's magic. And the food's dynamic, and the way they wait on you is amazing. But my little scourge on over to Vegas, and I think I'm really starting to enjoy and appreciate being in California, because in another month I'll be here 5 years, and I think maybe 3.5 of those years I was just trying to catch on and trying to have like, where am I? But now meeting you and some other great people out here, and I think going into now where I'm at now has given me the freedom to really expand into what I wanted to do. And I just want to thank you for allowing me to open up my first podcast with you as a guest.
You're welcome.
Sure we're going to have you down. We're going to have you again
frequent guests, and because when we have our luncheons, they're 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours, and we're talking about everything. So, but we'll have that on tape. Yes. Anything in some little final thoughts on this premiere edition, and maybe what we can look forward to maybe down the road.
I'm wishing you good luck, and there are many topics and many things to discuss. History. I never get into politics, and the reason why I never get into politics is because everyone has their own political opinion, and I think it's very divisive. And but the purpose of my life is to bring beauty through music to all people, regardless of their location or political views or whatever. And I think that as time goes on here, I'm going to be bringing new and different arrangements. I have many stories to talk about with the Wizard of Oz adaptation for the classical guitar, which has never been done before. That is a major kind of magnum opus, and the reason why is it's not just stringing together some of the tunes, even though that's partly what it is too, that it is expressing those in a complete manner. And there are so many stories of the Wizard of Oz, and next time we'll start with those.
Well, so probably in the next week or two, we'll have another edition of Karl's Corner with Jonathan again, and we could highlight that whole one. That'll be fantastic.
Okay, great.
I'm sure, other than that, you could have many, many more down the road, and I think really educate our audience on what you do and how you do it, but background too. So
thank you. Well,
Jonathan,
good luck.
I can't thank you enough.
Okay, and you have a wonderful rest of your week.
Yes,
okay,
and hang around. Don't leave right away. So, because when this records at it, so I'm going to thank you again for everybody